Welcome. There is a book that has now come out by author Andrew Cockburn called The Spoils of War: Power, Profit, and the American War Machine. Andrew Cockburn is the Washington editor of Harper's magazine. He is a journalist who has been covering national security for decades. He's a regular opinion contributor to the Los Angeles Times. He's written for, among others, New York Times, National Geographic, and the London Review of Books. Andrew Cockburn, thank you so much for being with us. I'm very grateful.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be with you, Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I think we are living at a time of reckoning in the United States. I think many people are being forced to look at things that they have not wanted to look at, not wanted to believe. So many of our current realities are in contradiction to so much that we have been brought up to believe about ourselves. And one of those things, of course, has to do with the U.S. military. I think the vast majority of Americans like to think we're the good guys and that we have a strong military because we have to, because there are all these bad people out there. But we are standing in all of our military pursuits for democracy and freedom and protecting the good guys and fighting off the bad guys, and that's the way it is. I think that naive sort of fairy tale version of the truth about the Pentagon and the U.S. military has been busted for millions and millions and millions of people who now look but don't even know where to begin. And that's why I so value your contributions. Thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to just go right in and ask you some questions that I think would be helpful to my audience. Is that all right?
Sure, let's go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to begin with a quote in the introduction. You say you're talking about some senior Marine generals talking about plans in Afghanistan on the ground, according to someone who was present at the relevant meeting, that when Trump ordered a surge, the general said, "It won't make any difference in the war, but it will be good for us at budget time." Then you go on to say Colonel John Boyd, the former Air Force fighter pilot who famously conceived and expounded a comprehensive theory of human conflict, once pointed out that there was no contradiction between the military's professed mission and its seeming indifference to operational proficiency. Quote, "People say the Pentagon does not have a strategy," he said. They are wrong. The Pentagon does have a strategy. It is, don't interrupt the money flow. Add to it. Unquote. Now, every time we read something like this, Andrew, everybody, gets on the internet and posts that famous speech by General Eisenhower, then President Eisenhower, in his farewell address to the nation, warning us about the military-industrial complex. We did not have a standing army at the beginning of World War II. Everyone was agreed. Obviously, we would need one after World War II, but Eisenhower warned us of the peril that would face this nation if there was this marriage of congressional and military and corporate power. How did it get so bad so fast after Eisenhower warned us?
Well, I mean, as you can see from Eisenhower's speech, we were already well on our way. That's what alarmed him. But I think, it was a combination of things. I mean, he made that speech because he was concerned, as you say, about, the rising power of the military. And crucially, I'm glad you mentioned that, the infiltration of the Congress, so the military industry, infiltration of the Congress. But right after that, we had a new administration come into power who said we weren't spending enough. We had to spend more. We were falling behind the Russians in missiles. It really, there was no one after Eisenhower had the credibility, had the desire, it seems, to attempt to cut back on the military. I think, Jimmy Carter made some noises about it when he was running in the 70s and in 1976, but that didn't last long. What we see and what I talk about in the book is how whenever there's a possibility of reining this in, of, that the spending might be heading in a downward direction, we immediately have a new threat. They discover a new reason to be scared, whether it be now it's the Chinese, before it was the Russians, or at one point they were saying even, the Venezuelans were going to attack us. So there's this I'd say it's like a virus, that exists. Like it's the Pentagon. I see the whole system as like a giant malignant virus that exists only to expand and guard it, both to grow and to safeguard its food supply. And the food supply is, of course, money. And this is really all about money.
Well, that's why it's called the blob here in Washington, D.C. Let me ask you a question. You were talking about the presidential administration after Eisenhower, which, of course, would be JFK. Now, if you look at the two parties today, the two major political parties are in lockstep in supporting the gargantuan budget of the military. Clearly, they are bought and sold. They are legally bribed by the military-industrial complex. Donations from Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, et cetera, clearly guide their actions. Now, at the time of Kennedy, there had to be a line of development there. Kennedy was not just trying to get money for the military defense contractors. He was actually a hawk on these issues, right? I mean, at what point did we go from presidents who were they were hawks, to presidents who were basically just representing such corporate interests that it didn't even matter anymore?
Well, I think, they just all became hawks. It became, absolutely, you couldn't even begin to think of, running and winning unless you were a hawk. Kennedy, he famously invoked the missile gap. There was a gap between us and the Russians in terms of missiles, that the Russians had more missiles than us. And then he got into office and, hey, presto, turns out there isn't a gap, but nevertheless, they went ahead and built anyway. I think it's, I think if I could think of a sort of deciding moment in all this, when it became clear that the system was really beyond redemption, it was 1980, when it was a friend of mine, Ernie Fitzgerald, who was a Pentagon official, a famous whistleblower, and he said the Joint Chiefs auctioned off the presidency from the battlements of the Pentagon. That it was made clear at that point.
Wait, I want you to repeat that line. It is so extraordinary. You just said that the Joint Chiefs auctioned off the presidency. Please say the whole line again.
Yes. In the 1980 election, the Joint Chiefs auctioned off the presidency from the battlements of the Pentagon. They made it clear that, that whoever promised them the most money, they would get their support. And that's really what happened. Carter had been busily increasing the defense budget in the last years of his presidency, and Reagan promised even more. So the military made it clear that their preferred candidate was Reagan. And I think that I always, not many people now remember that, but I remember it very clearly. And I think from then on in, there was no stopping them. If you look at what happened in the 1991, the beginning of the 90s, the Soviet Union, that had been the justification for this enormous military machine for 40 years, that, the Cold War, we had to pursue the Cold War. We had to be ready to defend ourselves against the Soviets, the evil communists. Well, suddenly they collapsed. They weren't there anymore. What happened to our defense budget? It declined by actually a comparatively small amount, about 3 or 4%, for a few years. And they did dismantle quite a lot of units and everything, and brought troops home from Germany. And then by 1997, hey presto, we were off to the races again. The defense budget started going up. So this is a system that demands, if there isn't an enemy, they have to create one.
They create one. Well, even like with the Afghanistan war, we left Afghanistan and then immediately increased the defense budget.
Sure, increase it even more. Next, the 22 budget is now slated to be almost just a shade under $780 billion.
Well, the corporate raiding of the U.S. government that began under the Reagan administration included not only, of course, the military defense contractors, but so many other industries as well. Now, you were talking about Kennedy and the missiles, of course, and he was famous for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What has happened? Talk to me in terms of the nuclear industry and how that has built to the point that people don't even try anymore. You know, when I was younger, we used to march in the streets, ban the bomb. I don't think the average American even realizes that the United States has like 7,000 in our arsenal. And the smallest nuclear bomb that exists today makes Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like a pinprick. How do you see the nuclear issue at this point?
Well, I think it's incredibly scary for the reason, partly the reason you just said, which is that, you know, in our young days, people used to march against the bomb. I remember in 1981, 82, there were 1 million people demonstrated in New York for a nuclear freeze. I mean, it was a huge issue. No one seems to give a hoot. But it's more dangerous than ever. It's more dangerous because, unnoticed by so many people, they're adopting a much more sort of casual attitude towards nuclear war. You know, they're making small nuclear weapons. This is extremely dangerous. They're making nuclear weapons that they say, well, they're so small. I mean, they're not really small. I think they've introduced one which has the potential yield of 300, the equivalent of 300 tons of TNT, which is an enormous explosion. But that's considered a mini nuke. And they're saying there's, you know, the line with conventional weapons is getting blurred. Makes it more likely they would actually use them. And I see this as incredibly dangerous, that there's a whole school of thought in Washington of, you know, these young analysts. None of them actually ever been in a war themselves. They wouldn't muddy their feet with that. But they're arguing, oh, yes, we could have a limited nuclear war with China over Taiwan. This is incredibly frightening. And I really do wish people would protest more about it.
Now, under the Obama administration, we actually increased our nuclear arsenal. How about under Trump? How did things go in terms of nuclear arrangements under Trump, and how are they under Biden?
Well, they're just carrying on. I mean, you can't see too much.
That's all they do, really. Yeah.
You can't really see too much difference between them. They all, Obama, you know, okayed a major, they call it modernization. Really, it's a whole new nuclear force they're building at staggering cost. Starting in 2010, he authorized it. New bomber, new missile, new submarine missile.
The B-21 Raiders.
The B-21s. They fessed up finally what it's going to cost, $200 billion per. Can you believe that? 203 actually. A new ICBM, again, incredibly dangerous for all sorts of reasons. New missile subs, I mean, first of all, it's sort of, it'll bankrupt us because the costs are completely out of control. I don't want to get too technical about it, but basically they're proceeding with the production of all these things before they've been tested. So then we don't really know what they're going to cost. I mean, now they've put this, as I said, a $200 billion cost on the bomber per copy. But because the thing isn't properly designed yet, we don't really know how it's going to work, if it's going to work. It means whatever, but we can't get rid of the system because there are people, contractors all over the country, every congressional district and certainly every state in the union. It'll be politically impossible to stop, so they can basically charge what they like.
Well, it's politically impossible if someone is a complete coward and only cares about their job as opposed to the welfare of the country. But that's another topic that we'll get to. You talk quite a bit in the book about Afghanistan, and Americans were awakened to the debacle of our exit strategy. But what people were not aware enough of is all of the terrible things that were happening while we were there. Particularly the last 10 years, and you and others have certainly pointed out that this had very little to do with beating back the Taliban at a certain point. And especially also you talk quite a bit about in your book about the nefarious covert relationship between the United States military, for instance, our supporting Pakistan, while Pakistan itself had created the Taliban. This is the kind of thing where Americans are now saying, what were we doing in Afghanistan? We know that it was a $2.3 trillion war. $2 trillion of that went directly to the military contractors. What do you want people to know about our involvement in Afghanistan?
Well, I think they should realize that for the people in charge, it was a tremendous success. I mean, in general terms, we look, obviously the US lost. The Taliban are back in power. But for the people running the war, it was a huge success. I mean, you said $2 trillion. Some people got those $2 trillion. That's a lot of money, even today. So, for, as you quoted a minute ago, you were saying how quoting me, saying, the Marine generals saying, well, it's not going to, sending more troops won't make any difference to the war, but it'll do us good at budget time. That was the point. For 20 years, the war on terror, particularly as fought in Afghanistan, was a huge money generator. I mean, it really served its purpose. And so who cares, really, if by the end of it all, out of Afghanistan is in even more ruins than it was before, and the people we were fighting are back in power.
Not even to mention the horror of the suffering and the death of 3,500 American soldiers, other Allied soldiers, and how many Afghans died in that war?
No one really knows. It's
really, no one knows, but hundreds of thousands for sure.
It could be more. You go to places like Helmand province that were heavily bombed, and you'll find every family will say, "Oh, we lost 12 people." 10, 12, 15 people. So no one knows, but it was horrendous.
A topic that is hot right now has to do with our very corrupt relationship with the regime in Saudi Arabia. There was a lot of talk before Biden was elected that he was going to stop our cooperation with the Saudis that enabled them to perpetrate a genocidal war against the Yemenis. Today, however, we're back to selling arms to Saudi Arabia. There doesn't seem to be a way for us to end this. Tell us more about Yemen and what's going on there.
Well, right. Well, the Saudi. I'm surprised, there's anything in Yemen left, because the Saudis have been bombing it now for 6 years, relentlessly, steadily. They haven't. I mean, by the way, they're losing. I mean, the Houthis, their Houthi enemies, are controlling more and more of the country, but. And we go on supporting them. As you said, Biden promised to end that. I mean, there's a bipartisan consensus in Congress. I mean, people complain there's no bipartisanship. Well, there is. This issue is so disgusting that it has brought Democrats and Republicans together to end U.S. support. And yet, we're still supported. We're still selling weapons to Afghanistan, to Saudi Arabia, bombs and missiles. Particular beneficiary is the Raytheon Corporation, routinely going out the door. And as I describe in the book, to really understand how deeply rooted this system is, there's a place called Eskan village outside the Saudi capital of Riyadh, where there's 1,000 Americans there, American service people and their families. And their mission is allegedly to train the Saudi forces, but their actual mission, and this is written down, is to sell them weapons. I mean, so we have a huge part of our military deployed in Saudi Arabia as arms salesmen. We have, the Saudi military itself can't really keep going, certainly can't keep flying without American contractors keeping the planes, maintained, because the Saudis apparently can't do it themselves. So, we are inextricably linked. It's not like we are supporting the Saudi war in Yemen. It's the U.S.-Saudi war in Yemen.
Thank you. So war profiteering used to be considered a crime, and now it's an industry.
It's a way of life. back in Vietnam, I remember there was someone saw a graffiti in a Lockheed Corporation plant in California and said, "Don't knock the war that feeds you."
Oh,
And that's that's the
that
way
really says it all.
it says it all. Yeah.
Well, over 50% of all jobs in the United States are at least indirectly defense related. And the argument, of course, is that we have a war economy. So many people's jobs depend on it. But the truth of the matter is something I think that Americans need to realize is that there's a greater return on investment in a peace economy, whether it has to do with education, healthcare, the things that actually build people's lives. And I think the conversation we need to be having is just as we're talking and people realize the importance of talking about a shift from a dirty economy to a clean or green economy, we have to also shift from the idea of a military economy, a war economy, to a peace economy. JFK said, if we don't end war, war will end us. And
Yeah.
it's like you said, people aren't even talking about these things right now, such as nuclear bombs. People are partly fatigued, partly exhausted. And also, I think, Andrew, for people like you and me, we have an institutional memory. We have we're old enough to have a memory of a time when we did stand up to the U.S. war machine. We did push it back, and we pushed it back successfully in relation to the Vietnam War. But as you have said here today, and as you talk about in your book, they just keep on going. It's just this parasite that will get rid of one symptom. One war is just a symptom. The Vietnam War is a symptom. The Afghan War is a symptom. The Iraq War was a symptom. But we're not getting to that root cause. And that root cause, it seems to me, the only way we will get to the root cause is if more people understand the depth of the corruption that is involved here, which takes us to the subject of the political parties. I'm sure that you have dealt in your own mind writing this book and writing all of the books that you work on. The only way you can go to sleep at night, the only way you can keep going, I'm sure, is if you think there must be some way out of this. What, in your opinion, is a way out of this? If both major corporate-backed parties, which are whores to the military-industrial complex, no matter who is president, whether it's Obama or Trump or Biden or Bush. These guys just keep throwing the money at the military-industrial complex. How do we stop this?
Well, I think I don't have a complete answer, but I think one very important thing to get into people's heads is this is all done in the name of defense. We got to have, okay, so maybe we're wasting a lot of money or, spending, giving away too much to the contractors. Maybe there's a lot of inefficiency and so forth, but we need this powerful defense. And it's got to get into people's heads that we don't actually get much defense out of it, very little. We do keep losing these wars. And I love the way you describe them as symptoms. Because their first objective is not, fighting efficiency and martial prowess, but getting the money, doing us good at budget time, that's you get a lousy defense out of it. So you get, planes that don't work, inaccurate, all the things that don't work. There's a terrible, there's a Navy program, the littoral combat ship that basically can't make it across the Atlantic. And, there's a host of examples that
They don't care.
They don't care.
Yeah.
They don't care. And that's why, you do get people on the, the right wing of the Republican Party who agree with this. People, as I've said before, that they, people who I talk to who give me, information I use in the book and other writings, their political views on other matters, on social issues, does make my hair stand on end. But we agree on this, and I think that's something that the public at large has to really understand, that they're being ripped off. They're being not just spending too much money, they're not getting anything in return.
I remember when Ronan Farrow wrote his book, The War on Peace, and he talked about the fact that there was a transformation from a time when the State Department truly was leading foreign policy in the United States, and when it basically was turned over to the military for the most part, that our foreign policy is dominated by military concerns, and as you make so clear in this book and elsewhere, our military policy is dominated by financial concerns, short-term profit, and this, of course, is the corruption of our society across the board. There's a lot of money to be made in sick people, found the health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of money to be made in people who have committed even petty crimes that we can put in jail, found the prison industrial complex, and there's a lot of money to be made in these military misadventures. And what you were saying is so true. It's an awakening inside people. We don't, everybody keeps saying we have the most powerful military in the world. If we're the most powerful military in the world, how come we just lost 3 wars in a row? I mean,
what else do you need to say?
Yeah. So what do you feel if people, as long as we do have, and of course this is getting into political areas that are outside the purview specifically of your book, but I'm sure you've thought about this plenty. It seems to me in so many areas, including this one, the problem is probably not the consciousness of the American people. The problem is the damage that's been done to our democracy, so that the will of the people is so often not represented by the actions of our government. As long as this corporatized duopoly has this chokehold on the process, and as long as these defense industries have a chokehold on the parties, it's going to take some real revolutionary turn of events, I think, for there to be a fundamental pattern disruption.
Yeah, I agree. And unfortunately, the control is getting, more tighter all the time. The greater and greater control of the media, greater and greater efforts to stamp out the internet, which for a time was a very democratic medium, which is becoming
correct.
Less so. They're getting great efforts to clamp down on that. And just to sort of the propaganda that's getting more and more insidious. I mean, people now, just on, particular military subject we're talking about, I mean, they're really teaching people to hate China. It's Chinese Americans of Chinese descent are now, facing harassment in the street. It's absolutely disgusting. And yet, that's becoming acceptable.
Well, as long as you brought up the topic, Taiwan, what are your thoughts about what's going to happen there? The Chinese, I felt the way we left, the way we left Afghanistan. I remember saying to my friend Joe Cirencione, you might know, at the Quincy Institute, I said, I'm sure that generals in China and Russia are looking very closely at all this, chuckling and making their plans. And of course, it wasn't long after that the Chinese planes were penetrating into Taiwanese airspace, etc. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, it's very, it is frightening. Certainly the Taiwan, the threat to Taiwan is being sort of pumped up here in the media from the Pentagon. I mean, it's like more and more journalists are acting like stenographers, just repeating. I mean, just take the one little point you just mentioned. We were told that Chinese planes were penetrating into Taiwanese airspace, but they weren't really. The Taiwaners declared an air defense identification zone, which most countries have, which is like the area you watch, and you basically for air traffic control purposes, but you don't control it. It's not, it doesn't belong to Taiwan. And what the Chinese were doing was sending planes that went along the very edge of this. Look, I mean, even the Taiwanese chief of staff of the Taiwanese Air Force said the other day that he said they were just training flights. And yet people here are being terrified on a nightly basis by cable news into believing that China's really already attacking Taiwan. I believe.
Okay, I'm sorry, go on. Please go on.
I just want to say. No, you go on.
Well, I want to deconstruct that a little bit, because it sounds like I was one of the people who bought into a media narrative, which you described as them just being stenographers to military spokespeople. Now, we were told for a very long time not to worry about Hong Kong. Because it was such a successful capitalist enterprise that China was not going to act too vigorously to clamp down on freedoms, etc. Well, obviously that turned out to be wrong. So when Xi said our patience will not last forever regarding Taiwan, was it really so unreasonable of us to have concerns about Taiwan? Not that I think there's anything we could do about it. I think really that's my point.
Well, yes. I mean, Xi, he's obviously not a particularly person one would like to be ruled by. I find it fairly repellent, his whole cult of personality and his increasingly repressive regime. On the other hand, they do keep saying about vis-a-vis Taiwan that they wanted to be part of unify China by peaceful means. I think the great mistake we've made is by amping up, making these threats, getting off this ambiguity. I mean, I don't normally have kind words for Henry Kissinger, but he did help establish this situation where everyone pretended to agree that China was really one country, and they had happened to have two different governments in different parts. And when we started straying off that, and let me say in a second why I think that's happened, the Chinese, that gave the excuse on the other side to start sounding more bombastic. Let me say, I was about to say earlier that a great friend of mine who died recently, who was a longtime Pentagon official and weapons designer, he said, on the basis of his many years there, he said, the US government has two functions: to buy arms at home and sell arms abroad. And if you look at what's really been going on in Taiwan, a lot of it has been to do with the opportunity to sell ever more arms to Taiwan. I think that's, as we've been said, during this conversation, we've said it's all about money. And I think a lot of the hoopla now about the threat to Taiwan and what we're going to do to defend Taiwan and are the Chinese going to attack Taiwan is to do with, this is a great way to generate money, especially after the Afghan money tap has been turned off.
Well, that's very clear. All they've done is just when President Biden said we've ended the war in Afghanistan, all they did was start moving ships into the South China Sea, et cetera. And as you make so clear in the book, who can be the enemy that we get people scared about today? What can be the issue that gets people all revved up today so that we can justify the military spending? I want everybody to be very clear. The book is called The Spoils of War. When it says power, profit, and the American war machine, there should not be a war machine. There shouldn't be a war machine. There should be military activity that we absolutely feel that we must partake of when, in fact, there is real justification to do so. And I'm so grateful to you, Andrew Cockburn, for making it clear what the facts are. And I think that for all of you who are listening, what's important we realize is that if we continue to elect people, if people continue to talk about issues that don't even have anything to do with this, I noticed when I ran for president last year how little conversation there was regarding military policy, regarding foreign policy. I would talk about it. Bernie Sanders would talk about it. Tulsi would talk about it. And obviously it was not considered convenient by the party powers that be. And people have just been lulled to sleep. People have just been lulled to sleep. And this is as dangerous. We should see the trajectory of American military policy as every bit as dangerous as our environmental policies. We have now awakened people to the realization that environmental degradation is an existential threat to our species. So is our military posture. You cannot continue to just casually make nuclear bombs. You cannot have a citizenry that it continues to be so disengaged from this topic and not be on a march to future horror. It just It just can't happen. So I thank you, Andrew Cockburn, for writing a book and all of your writing, which awakens people. And I know it can't be, I think of you writing a book like this. It can't be psychologically and emotionally easy to write a book like this. It can't be easy to be the one who is shouting out in what in some cases must feel like the wilderness to say, this is happening, this is happening. But I hope you realize that many of us want to read this book because we want the information, because we know that it's true, and we want to take your message, help amplify it, help to warn the people of the United States, who I do think are good and dignified and noble people at heart, who, if they know the facts and see a way out of this mess, will pave the way out of this mess. And as it happens, which I do believe it will happen, you are one of the people towards whom we will owe a great debt of gratitude. So I thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Marianne. And thank you for everything you're doing.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about the book or about any of your other work that you'd like to mention before we leave?
No, I mean, you can read me fairly regularly in Harper's magazine. I'm the Washington editor, and I have a long column every couple of months. And I think people just, I really urge people, what I think one of the things that's been going on, sadly, is a sort of less and less capacity for interest in critical thinking, less and less ability to, really think when someone announces, oh my gosh, we have to, the Russians are about to invade somewhere, or Chinese are about to invade somewhere, or whatever, we have to fight this threat or that threat, to think it through and think, wait a minute, is that actually likely? Or, maybe it might be, maybe it might not. But, more and more we have to use our own heads because we're being fed so much misinformation.
Well, Lloyd Austin, who is our Secretary of Defense, is a former board member at Raytheon. The very fact that we now go against the traditions of Congress and allow a former general or a general to be the head of the Defense Department, which of course should be led by by a civilian. He made a big deal about changing into his civilian clothes, but it takes more than that to change your headset from a state of the board member of Raytheon to the head of the U.S. Defense Department. And it's these little things that aren't little at all that we just allow to happen that have gotten us into this situation. But the more information that we get about how bad it is, I think the more conviction and more passion and more sense of responsibility we will have towards making it good. A fundamental pattern disruption. And people such as yourself are helping to make it happen. So thank you very, very much.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Well, I hope that conversation with Andrew Cockburn was as illuminating for you as it was for me. It's so important with the 2022 elections coming up in less than a year that we all be very participatory. I hope that you will go to town hall meetings, whether they are in person or virtual, and you will not pass up the opportunity to ask the candidates about military spending, ask them about foreign policy, ask them about the endless war machine, and see what they say. And if they don't have a good answer, if they're not talking about the reduction of our defense budget and the reimagining of our defense posture throughout the world, if they don't recognize that we have a problem here, it's just further corporatization, whether it has to do with our healthcare policies being driven by short-term profit for health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies, whether it has to do with so many of our criminal policies being driven by corporate profits for the prison industry, private prison industry, whether it has to do with so many of our environmental policies being driven by fossil fuel companies, our food policies by chemical companies and big agriculture, and of course our foreign policy and military policies by defense contractors. It's all one big matrix of corruption. And the more you and I know, information is power. The more you and I know, and what I hope you receive from these conversations is not just knowing how corrupt it is, but an articulation of specifics. That's what I feel very committed to, providing the kind of articulation of specifics that Mr. Cockburn provided for us today. I have a couple of questions. One is from a woman named Rosalie, and she said, Marianne, during your presidential campaign, you talked about a Department of Peace. How do we move forward on that now? Okay, Department of Peace, even early on in our founding, there were people talking about a Department of Peace. I first heard about it when former U.S. Congressman Dennis Kucinich was in office trying to pass a Department of Peace, and I co-founded an organization called the Peace Alliance to help foster support for that. Dennis Kucinich is no longer in Congress. It is now theoretically being headed as a bill having to do with the Department of Peace building, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, but it's not given any kind of high-level support by the Democratic Party, and essentially it's just performative. Nobody's really doing anything with that right now. But let's talk about why. I think why is answered very clearly by the conversation that we're having here today. Corporate profits are not made by building peace. Corporate profits are created by preparing for war. And that's as sick as that is, that's the reality. As corrupt as that is the reality. In the meantime, we continue to articulate what should be. As I said in the conversation with Andrew Cockburn, while we do have a war economy, while over 50% of all jobs created in the United States are at least indirectly related to defense industry activities, the return on our investment is actually greater with peace building and peace economy activities. What is peace building activities? Educating people, health care for people, economic opportunity, etc. The important thing about a Department of Peace is that it would address both domestic as well as international concerns. We have a military academy right now. We need a peace academy. We need a multi-year curriculum where people would, in exchange for their education at the Peace Academy, then go out, whether it has to do with corners of the United States or other corners of the world, in order to demonstrate these peace-building behavioral patterns. What are they? Number one, expanding economic opportunities for women. Number two, expanding educational opportunities for children. Number three, the reduction of violence against women. And number four, the amelioration of unnecessary human despair. Whenever you have those four factors increased, you have an increase in peace and you have a decrease in violence. In the meantime, I think, particularly now, as we're taping this, all the schools except for one in Oakland County, Michigan, have been closed due to credible school shooting threats following the terrible tragedy of school shooting that occurred there just the other day. We're a very violent society, but while guns are a part of the issue, and we do need gun safety laws, common sense gun safety laws. That is not calling for the repeal of the Second Amendment. The first 10 amendments in the U.S. Constitution are the Bill of Rights. We should not be messing with the Bill of Rights. And the founders put the Second Amendment in there for a reason, which of itself I support, as do millions of Americans, the idea that the government should not be the only entity that can have guns. On the other hand, they were talking about a well-organized militia. Our founders could not even conceive of the kind of plethora of assault weapons, AR-15s, AK-47s that exist, not only that exist, but are in the hands of young people today, and so easily procured. You are free to drive wherever you want to drive, but there are stop signs and there are traffic signals. Well, you're free to bear arms. That shouldn't mean that anybody should be able to get any gun anytime they want to, which is obviously the goal of the NRA, apparently. So we do need gun safety laws, and we absolutely must take a stand against the tyranny of the NRA. On the other hand, we have to face the fact that we are a violent nation in many ways. Our environmental policies are violent towards the earth. Our criminal justice policies are often violent towards the poor, particularly people of color. There are so many aspects of our policy-making decisions which are essentially violent. So much gratuitous violence in movies and television and song lyrics, all just because of the money that is made there. And I think we all have to address the violence in our hearts. Martin Luther King said we need quantitative changes in our circumstances and also qualitative changes in our souls. We all have violent thoughts, every unloving thought, every unforgiving thought. So if we really want the fundamental pattern disruption from war to peace, then it will take some inner work as well as outer work. Part of that inner work, though, is we will no longer be complacent or disengaged. We will, in the ways that I said before, participate in electoral politics, so that we will have a chance to do as JFK said. He said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." And once again, changing from a war economy to a peace economy is as important as changing from a dirty economy to a clean economy. I hope that you feel that these conversations empower you in some way, inform you in ways that make you a more vital and educated and articulate participant in the conversations that will drive us forward. Thank you so much for being with me. Remember, mariannewilliamson.substack.com, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.